So it should be no secret by now, followers of the channel, one of my favorite openings to play with the white pieces is the Catalin setup, where we get the following formation with our pawns on d4, c4, a knight on f3, and then try to fianchetto our kingside bishop. And I'd like to update you guys on my most recent over the board game that I played in the Catalin opening against Jonas here, who has a FIDE rating of close to 1800, and I thought it would be helpful for you guys to see how this game basically unfolded in the opening. So we start off with 1d4, and d5 is the response. I play c4. You can also, if you want to cut down on theory, try to play this move order with knight f3 and g3. I'll probably talk about this more in the future. The benefit, for example, is that you avoid some openings like the Alban counter gambit, but you allow other stuff like black potentially getting space in the center with c5. So that is something to keep in consideration, but in this game I decided to go for c4, plays e6, knight to f3, I go for the Catalin with g3 finally, and he plays this move bishop to b4 check. Probably one of the most solid lines against the Catalin, and the reason is that after bishop to d2, what Jonas ends up doing is he plays bishop to e7. And some people will look at this and think this is very strange, because what black has done here basically is they've spent two moves with their bishop only to bring it back to e7 when it looks like, you know, why can't they just do that in one move? But the whole point is that if you play bishop to e7 immediately, in many lines what white actually wants to do is bring their knight to d2 and eventually use that knight. For example, one very common ways can unfold is, let's say black plays c6. The main line is actually d takes c4, but if black plays in the spirit of the closed Catalan, where they sort of keep a closed pawn formation, they maybe fianchetto their queenside bishop eventually, what white's probably going to aim for is this setup where they play queen c2, knight d2, and then eventually play like the e4 break, gain space in the center, and try to put a lot of pressure on black in this fashion. A lot of people, for example, already take, but this is very nice for white when they have the space advantage with these pawns against kind of these. But of course, when you go bishop to b4 check first, bishop to d2, bishop e7, and you try to repeat all these same moves, you run into the issue now that like b6, and well, we can't really go knight to d2 because you can't put another piece on top of another. That's illegal. So that means that if you do want to go knight d2, you're going to have to like spend a tempo moving the bishop or doing something fancy like that. And you might also be thinking, well then, if we really want to put the knight on d2, why are we working with the bishop? Why can't we move our knight? And you are somewhat correct, but the problem with doing this is that sometimes now black can actually go d takes c4, exploiting the fact that like there's this pin, and black can maybe get very ambitious and try to, you know, play up a pawn like this and ask white, like, where is their compensation? This is definitely a valid way of playing with white, but bishop d2 is a little bit simpler, you could say, and that is why I, in the game, decided to play bishop to d2. So bishop e7, the following moves happen, and I did indeed go queen to c2. Some people might think like, oh, that's not a good thing to be doing. You want to like develop all your minor pieces before you move the queen, but problem is if you play knight to c3 here, you might just be running into, for example, d takes c4, and black is just going to play b5 next, consolidate it, be a pawn up. If you play knight e5 to try and regain it, well, the bishop actually on d2 is doing a great disservice to your position, because after queen takes d4, you're not just down one pawn, you're down two, and you don't even get the c4 one. So queen to c2 is what I do, b6, and rook d1 is a common sort of move that you play at some point. Very often the rook can eventually play some sort of useful role. For example, if you can envision a position in which maybe like we develop our bishop and a knight here. For example, if they have a take and we go d takes e5, you can see that the rook is exerting some pressure down on the d file, and that to some extent can be useful. It depends on the position, but generally rook d1 is a useful move to throw in. He develops his knight to d7 though, play pawn to b3, and the basic idea is like, okay, again, if I go knight to c3, is probably going to take that, and maybe I can play like e4, but I'm not really sure how great my compensation is. It's not like forced for him to take, but it definitely is a principled response to me sort of losing contact with the c4 pawn. So that's why I went b3 first, and there's two options that black has here. One is bishop to b7, and I'd say the slightly more annoying one is bishop to a6. Sometimes black can also go like a5 and try to gain space on the queen side, but it's a bit more common for black to just move their bishop And I think this one in particular is kind of annoying, and the reason is that now in this position, we run the issue that if we try to develop our knight, well then they're just going to take the pawn again, and it's not that straightforward because like, okay, we can always play e4 and get like these sorts of positions, but it definitely is not something that everyone necessarily wants to do, sacrificing the pawn. So sometimes, for example, you'll further prepare this with something like bishop to f4 and then like go knight to d2 in this fashion. But to be honest, I think it's slightly better now to go knight to c3 once a rook is moved to sacrifice a pawn, because now we can go e4. And if they go a takes b3, notice how because the rook is on c8, if they try and move the bishop backwards, then the a7 pawn is going to hang, whereas that was not the case when the rook was on a8. But okay, bishop to b7 was played instead. This is a kind of more common among lower rated players, I would say, because it looks more like kind of safe and quote unquote normal, whatever that means, right, to put the bishop on sort of the normal fianchettoed square on the diagonal. But the problem is, because it doesn't put any pressure on c4, that means we're free to go knight to c3. We don't have to spend any extra moves or gambit a pawn or anything, and we can get in our e4 break as we desired. It is also maybe possible to go c5 for black and try and stop this, but then they have to contend with the fact after c takes d5, maybe the position is going to open up and it might not be to their favor. For example, if they take e takes d5, they're going to probably be stuck with this hanging pawn structure, and whether that's good for them or not is up for debate. Usually it would be considered that white's a little bit better in these sorts of positions because these pawns in the center can be used as weaknesses for us to attack. So it is also possible, if they want to avoid that structure, maybe they can go knight takes d5, but this does run the issue that maybe, right, like after takes, for example, takes e4, that we're gaining a lot of space in the center, we're gaining tempi, and after bishop to b7, white could, for example, continue advancing forward with d5, and if black tries to grab the pawn, it does look quite risky. I think the best move here is to go bishop to c3, and basically with the pressure coming down on this file, let's say black plays moves such as bishop to b7, I wouldn't be surprised if knight g5 works, attacking h7, also attacking the bishop, so you're kind of forced to take this. But then after take, let's say rook b8, bishop c6, it's hard to believe that you're not losing material along the d file. So c5, there's definitely some risk associated with it. Rook c8 was played instead in the game, allowing myself to go e4, and then after d takes e4, I kind of decided in the game, you know, like I could just be normal and play knight takes e4, and there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Black is probably going to go for some sort of combination like of taking and then going c5, but I decided, like, without really that much thinking, that, you know, I've seen this one other idea before in the Catalin where sometimes instead of taking back immediately, you can also play your knight to g5 and try to recapture on e4 like this, and also kind of open up the bishop on the diagonal at the same time, maybe in some lines. So knight g5 is what I did. If he goes h6, of course I'm just taking this, no problem, and if he plays c5, well then, like, that's going to be very bad because I'm winning a piece with a discovered check. However, the problem is, in this position, maybe not strictly speaking a problem, but at least in the game I felt it was like a bit of a problem, right, where he played c5 and just started counterattacking my center, and I kind of have to respond to that and do something about it. Of course, one of the first things that might come to mind is maybe, let's say, knight takes e4, but I wasn't super convinced about this. Just after like taking, takes, and let's say c takes d4, black is up a pawn right now, and I don't think I have any really good discovered attacks. For example, if I go knight g5, they can just take it, I can take, but I don't really think this leads to anything special. So I was mainly tossing up here between like d takes c5 and trying to maybe keep the tension with a move like bishop to e3, and then only take back on the next move, because, like, if we're being real, that pawn is not going anywhere. So I ended up playing bishop to e3 out of fear that if I played d takes e5 takes, for example, that, like, you know, if I wasn't careful, right, like if I just take here immediately, this position is going to be very difficult for me to really make anything out of. Like, yeah, okay, maybe I have a 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side, but more or less it is pretty equal, and it's going to be very difficult to win this sort of position. And I was also looking at, after knight takes c5, going bishop to f4 first, and then say going queen to e8, and I was considering some stuff like knight b5, but it felt kind of wrong because, like, I'm leaving this pawn on e4 and I'm trying to like cheapo him with all these weird knight d6 stuff, and the truth is, like, yeah, it's not good after h6, kicking my knight back, And there are a few different good moves to black here. Apparently they can play g5, rook d8 and just give up the a7 pawn. They can probably put their knight on d3 at some point. My position is basically a wreck. None of my pieces kind of make sense on the squares they are on. So it turns out though I still should have gone for this, but after queen to e8 I should have just taken this. And like, I definitely considered this, but I really underestimated the position, and there apparently had been a couple games that had reached this position before, and every single time in the database, white had actually won. And the reason is if you actually look closer, it's kind of difficult for black to respond to white's threat, which is queen b7 on the next move, just targeting a bunch of weaknesses. And if you say play queen to c6 to try and stop that, well then after takes, rook d7, we transform the position into an endgame where we're forking these two pieces and we're gonna probably be up a pawn. So also if they go, I did miss bishop to f6, but so maybe they're not losing a pawn, but still probably after rook to d1, like I think we are better, right? We control the only open file on the board, our pieces are a bit more active. Also in the endgame, typically having the pawn majority on the queen side is going to be a bit of an advantage because it's further away from sort of the king side where the kings are located. But okay, instead of going for that d takes c5 takes, and actually after the game we were talking and my opponent said that he was planning on taking with the bishop, which I was a little bit surprised by because I thought that then after takes I'm sort of hitting his bishop with tempo and I would be pretty happy to get the bishop here. If he takes this, I think he was saying something about playing like this in the game, but then like I do with the bishop here, I'm gaining the tempo, and I thought like this is nothing to really be avoiding. But okay, again the issue was knight takes e5, and I was like thinking, okay, if I take on e4 it's gonna allow like all these exchanges, that's annoying. But I was kind of being lazy and I didn't really look all the way until the end when again like this sort of position was just pretty good for white, or at least like, you know, I'm have some genuine chances, not just like a complete draw. So c5 though, bishop to e3, and he ends up taking it, which I was happy with because I was kind of a little bit concerned he might go say knight g4 for example, and then try to like win the bishop here, and I was going to go for this position and allow this, and like I am sort of maybe increasing my control of the center, you could say, since I'm recapturing towards the center, but I really didn't like giving up the dark squared bishop. Not to mention it's actually very difficult to move these pawns because the moment I move this pawn, for example, I create a bunch of weaknesses in the dark squares. If I ever take, same sort of issue. So I'm probably just gonna have to keep the tension for a while and hope like black someday decides to like take on d4 and kind of make my life a little bit easier like that. However, it's not completely easy for black either because like for example, whenever they move their queen, they might have to watch out for like some random knight b5 cheapos or something like that. So that is a drawback of bishop to e3 that's going to run into something like knight g4, but that wasn't really exploited in the game. He just took after not too much thinking, takes queen to c7, getting off of this file. That makes enough sense. I take and he takes, I take back, and here he plays e5 after not too much thinking. And then when I retreat, he goes f5. And to be honest, I was a little bit surprised by this. I thought he would just continue developing his pieces and play sort of like normal chess. But e5 and f5, it was definitely a surprise for me in the game because I thought that after knight to c3, even if he exchanges off my knight squared bishop, I thought that I get the d5 square for my knight, and like, you know, he can't really play knight f6 to stop that because then like he's gonna hang his pawn on f5. So it turns out probably he could have gotten a bit of a better like version of that by playing f5 first, and then like if I go knight to c3, well, not only do I not get the d5 square, but I might also be running into some logistical issues with like getting e5, bishop e3, f4, all with tempo. Maybe I have like knight d5 in there somewhere, but point being, he gets this whole thing where he trades off my knight squared bishop without my knight easily jumping in to the d5 square. Probably not going to be a super fun position for white. So I got a little bit lucky. He went for this idea, but not in the best version possible. He goes queen to c6 check, king g1. I can also go knight e5, but I thought like the order's probably like, I'm probably going to go knight e5 at some point, but I also thought like maybe there could be some other possibilities keeping the rook open on this file, so I thought king g1 was a bit more flexible. Not to mention when you move the knight here, it can't really do much for now because it's pinned. So I decided I was going to go king g1, he goes f4, and I think again this might have been a bit of a surprise for me, But it does make sense because like my light squared bishop is being exchanged off around my king. It's kind of weak. There's a good opportunity potentially to try and pounce and really try and score a home run. But the issue of this, one of the main ones I thought, was that you weaken the e4 square. So right off the bat, I was considering a possibility such as queen to e4 coming into the square and saying that, okay, black, if you decide to take this, then I'm going to take back. And all of a sudden, right, like I have this nice knight on an e4 outpost. We're in basically an endgame where I think my pieces are quite well placed. My bishop's better than yours. My rook is better than like both of yours combined. And like this e5 pawn is kind of a bit of a pain in the ass to really deal with because like the moment you move your knight, like that might be hanging, but it's not super simple. For example, if knight to f6, well, I have to deal with my hanging knight first, and if I take and then try to like take, well, that doesn't work, of course. And in this situation, black might just be getting in enough counterplay. So maybe, for example, in this position, I want to start perhaps with something like rook to e1, so that now after takes, I'm really keeping the pressure up on the e5 pawn. But even then, maybe still black has some cheeky ideas like take, bishop c5. Just saying, they don't really care about the e5 pawn because they're getting counterplay against this. Maybe we have rook f1. I'm not sure if black is really holding this together, but at the very least it is white who is in the driver's seat, and it's clear that while initially it might look a little bit scary what black is doing, definitely they have to be a little bit careful with all the weaknesses they are leaving behind in their position. That being said, however, queen to e4 was one of the main moves I was considering, but there was a second option which was also very tempting, knight to d5. My idea being I'm gaining a tempo on the bishop. Bishop to c5 is pretty much the most logical move, setting up the bishop on this diagonal and now threatening to go take, and then snatch the pawn on f2. Of course, if I allow that, I am eternally screwed. So I did not play h3, that was a mouse slip or whatever you want to call that. And what I instead did is I played a move which to many people would look very risky. I don't know how you would personally handle like this threat of f takes g3 coming next. Maybe you'd go like rook d2 so you can take back and defend this, but I wasn't really a fan of all of that. I decided to play g takes f4, and this is what I played it fairly quickly. As you can see from the clock time, I gained time on the clock, and the reason is that when I was thinking for 15 minutes here, when I was like trying to calculate stuff out, like my whole idea of going knight to d5 was that I would take on the next move, and then if black takes back, I assessed that this position now, let's say I go queen to e4 next, kind of nullifying the queen on this diagonal. My plan was to go like king h1, rook g1 maybe, and really use the bishop's opening on this diagonal to maybe even put pressure on black's king. And meanwhile, it's not super easy to put pressure on white's king. Like for example, if they had a light squared bishop instead of like, maybe like instead of the knight, for example, this would be a very dangerous situation for white, I think, but because that bishop is not on the board and they don't really have too many pieces around the king side, white can kind of get away with playing the seemingly weakening move in front of their king. Usually you don't want to do this, but I assess, and actually correctly so in this position, that you can play this. Apparently this was only the second top move though in this position. Apparently b4 is even stronger. To be honest, I didn't really look at this too closely because I thought this would be weakening this kind of c4 pawn too much after the bishop moves somewhere, but apparently it works quite well. But okay, g takes f4, not much worse than that move. And instead of e takes f4, actually Jonas gets a little bit adventurous here and he decides to play queen to h6, which basically has the idea of he's trying to argue that, you know, like he can take this any time he wants. That's not going to go anywhere. And well, if I like push or like I take, especially if I take, well then I'm gonna hang f2, and if f5 he can probably give a check and then take that. And instead of playing e takes f4 and having the file closed, if I go f5, then like if he wins that pawn, this is still open and he can really use that to put pressure on my king. So I just decided to stick to the game plan though, king to h1. It can never really be a bad idea in this sort of position just to get the king like away from danger, right? And I think I'll still like thinking like e takes f4 is probably what is going to happen at some point. But then Jonas, he really surprised me. He really did. He played rook takes f4, sacrificing an exchange. And basically if I don't take it, I'm screwed because this is under pressure. This is also a threat maybe. So I was like, okay, I mean, I take that. I don't think I'm missing any immediate tactics. But the whole point would be basically that in this sort of position, black supposedly has enough compensation with like maybe the knight coming around, the pressure on the f2 pawn, and white doesn't or isn't able to generate or maybe put up is a better word, a sufficient defense to defend against all of these different things. However, that's just not true. This is way too slow. These pieces are basically all on the the queen side rather, and it's basically just a one woman show over on the king side, which fails quite quickly after I go queen to e2, block all these checks. And you might be wondering, Sam, did you miss a free knight? And no, I did not, because take careful note, right? After queen to f3 check, king g1, queen g4 check, that's a fork, and you're also hitting the rook, so that's going to be equal material in a position where my king is also kind of weak, so I'm not a big fan. I guess technically you could say that maybe like in this position we can take on e5, but still, even though we are up a pawn, I can't help but feel that the king is just a little bit weaker than I would like it to be. Probably queen c6 check, maybe even rook f8 or something. I guess maybe it's not too bad, but it's also like, given that we were in exchange up in this position, I kind of see no real reason to do that. So queen to e2 is what I end up playing, just to stop the check. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to like suss out kind of like, if I play this right, what is black going to do on the next move? I was like, okay, well, now this is a serious threat. They can't just take the pawn, because then I'm going to take that. And there's no more of this whole like monkey business, right, with queen f3, queen g4 check. My queen is protecting that. So after bishop takes f2, instead of that rather, I was also looking maybe he can move the knight. But the problem is that when you move the knight now, because my queen's also attacking the e5 pawn, that goes nowhere. So that kind of left basically maybe just like either you defend the knight, which is passive, you just sacrifice an exchange. You can't just, I mean, sit there and hope something's gonna work. That's just not how chess works. So I was looking at another option though. Maybe if he ditches the knight still and goes rook to c6, goes rook h6, after, let's say, we take it, and just tries to go for a home run, maybe that could potentially work. It's not exactly easy to defend against this threat of kind of mating on h2. For example, let's say rook to c6 is played, rook takes d7, rook h6. One thing I noticed was that if I just played f3, then he can actually still take even though I'm defending it. Because if I take back for the queen, queen takes f3 check now, I can't go to g1 because the bishop's covering that square. So that means my only move is queen to g2, and then he can come queen to h5 check. Again, I can't move here. My only way is to block for the queen, but then the queen comes back, I block, and he can actually get a free fold repetition there with the checks. So I realized that if I am going to allow this whole rook c6 idea, I have to really have something prepared. Maybe I just go like, I don't know, rook g1 and rook g2 or something, but there was a part of me that really wanted to be able to punish this, and really the way to punish a sort of line like this, and it won't always work, but if there is a way to punish it, it's going to be involved just grabbing the kind of free knight right after rook c6. So I was really trying to figure out like, how can I win the knight but not get like mated or allow a free fold repetition. And I was looking at all my options, and eventually I stumbled upon rook takes g7 check, with the idea that if he takes it, then I take, and I'm forking the queen and king, and I'm just going to be winning material, and that pretty much leaves like him moving the king. But then from here with my rook on g7, I realized I could come back to g2 to defend against all the threats, and I'm just a rook up. So he ended up playing rook c6, and I was pretty happy to see this, because when I was thinking about queen e2, I was already kind of looking at some of these options, and then when this happened, I already knew what I had to do. I took it, here, I take, and then it kind of sunk in the reality for him. He thinks a little bit, plays king to f8, but I just go back to g2. I can also go g3 maybe, but, you know, we're spoiled for choices, point either one works. They both prevent the mate, we're a rook up, and with that, that was my most recent game that I played. Again, in the Catalin opening, I didn't really get anything too special out of the opening. I just want to kind of reiterate that I probably could have gotten like a very typical, like nice slight advantage if I had played d takes c5. And like, I know that doesn't sound that amazing, but the thing you have to understand about this sort of slight advantage is this is a sort of position which if you get, it's going to be a very fun sort of advantage, because like you just get to kind of just make like whatever moves you, okay, maybe not whatever, you have to be careful not to let your opponent back in the game, but your pieces are just more active, you can slowly increase the pressure, and you really just get to torture your opponent. And maybe that's just my definition of fun, but a lot of players, if they're like black in this sort of position, they're just going to self-destruct because, like, you know, people, they're impatient, they want like some immediate tactic, and if they don't get immediate tactic, they start getting grumpy, they start like throwing pieces all over the place, sort of like how happened in this game, right? I'm not calling Jonas out or anything, but he ended up, you know, sort of going for this exchange sacrifice. He wanted something really flashy, but it just didn't really work because my position fundamentally was quite sound and there was nothing like that wrong with it yet. So I was able to kind of diffuse the fire without too much effort and like won the game in quite short order. And really in this game, again, I didn't really do anything special. I just followed the plan that you typically go for in the Catalin, where you go for the e4 break, especially the closed Catalan, that is. And we had some exchanges in the center. Okay, again, I didn't play this the most accurately, but then eventually when he tried to get aggressive later on, you know, just keeping calm, not like overreacting, and then in the important kind of moment, making the right decision to open the king side up. And I think in a way this might have also tempted my opponent to really try and go for something ultra aggressive because he felt like he had this prime opportunity to take advantage of my king that was sort of out in the open. But again, that didn't really end up working. And yeah, that's going to be all I have to say for tonight, though it's kind of late here. I think it's like midnight now. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. I have nothing more to say. See ya.